what we also need here is a video capture device. Boop, there I am. There is everybody else. What just happened there? Whoa. Like that. All right, I should be able to do that quite nicely. All right, and what I want is some adjectives. Adjectives like wooden, big, small. Adjectives. Heavy. Bent. A few other adjectives. So, how are we doing on folks showing up here? You may be wondering why I'm talking about English in an engineering course. Not something we typically do. But we were talking last time about naming variables. And I was talking about, let's just head back over there. Oh, that's way farther than where we were. Here we are. So we were talking about using variable names that made sense, right? So we were mostly talking about methods. So things like generate by themselves aren't meaningful. Sometimes the context has to imply what they do. So in a class called labyrinth generator, the generate method probably generates labyrinths. In a class called file finder, find with a string with a variable name file name, it's going to find a file name called, or going to find a file called file name. When you lose context, you lose a lot more information. So it's all about naming not just the methods, but the classes themselves. A class called program that generates, is that going to generate a program? Probably not. There's probably something behind that. And this is a trap that you can fall into, because you can be extremely explicit about what something does and still be wrong. Here's something, a method called topic 6 exercise 12. It tells you exactly what this does. It answers exercise 12, topic 6, or chapter 6. Or the last exercise in the object-oriented programming lecture. But these are bad, specifically because they don't tell you what topic 6 exercise 12 is supposed to do. To determine whether or not you're using things in a good way, generate labyrinth generator, or a bad way, topic 6 exercise 12, I have a short guest lecture for you. Let's see if I can actually make this work correctly here. Guest lecture because there is a much smarter human out there who has said it much better than me.
It's not who I am underneath, but what I do that defines me.
Bruce?
Batman. It's not what he is underneath. It's what he does that defines him. It's what the thing does. That's really the litmus test for whether or not you're doing something correctly. When you're naming something, your method should say what it is doing, not what it is. Yes, it is the topic 6 exercise 12. Okay, but that's not what it does. Fast? So that's what you should think of. Think of Batman. Batman will tell you whether or not you've named it correctly. So maximal number subsequence. It's going to get the maximal subsequence of a group of numbers. Sure. That's a much better name than topic 6 exercise 12. Used to be that there were limits on the size of method names. You could only have certain sizes, but that's not really the deal. That's not really a problem anymore in modern languages, although there is some limit. I think 4,096 characters the last time I checked, but that's not really relevant. So when you're naming types, though, we have a whole nother set of rules. So we've talked about methods. Methods, what they do. Okay, they are finding something or doing something. When you're naming a type, a couple of things to keep in mind. One, all types in C# should be named with Pascal case. That's every word has a capital character starting it, and everything else is lowercase. Okay? Don't use underscores. I is a special first character, meaning that it's an interface. But other than that, they should be nouns. A recursive factorial calculator. It's a noun. A tree set calculator. I enumerable is the one sort of exception. It's something that is enumerable. Okay. When you are naming things, you're either naming them after nouns or adjective plus nouns. So like binary tree node. Tree node is the noun. Binary is the adjective. And this is something that's always fascinated me. And that's why I started, if you came in a little late, I started with a bunch of adjectives that I had looked up. Did you know that there is an unspoken rule about how adjectives are chained together? So look at this sentence. This is describing a statue, a wooden, heavy, lovely statue. The truth is, this is not the most. They teach it now. You get a list, a diagram about the order. That's true. It used to be that, or I was never taught that in class, that there was an order that English speakers tended to use, and if you didn't use it, it didn't sound right. Here it is, right here. In a terrible, terrible order. That's no good at all. Let's try that one more time. Can I take it like this? No. Why did it go? Oh no, hold on. Let's fix that a little bit. Anyway, it's opinion. Yeah, I can fix this pretty quick. Yeah, there we go. To size, 3 physical quality, 4 shape, 5 age, 6 color, origin. I wanted to just be able to paste this, but it's being a little difficult. Anyway, material, what it's made out of, type, 10, purpose. So there's 10 sets. So your opinion of it goes first. Its size would go next. Its physical quality after that. And I always thought that was fascinating. It was not something that was taught to me as a child, and until it was brought to my attention, it wasn't something that I really thought about a whole lot. But you would see this much more often. And it's really funny because you would almost always say things in that order. A strange green metallic material sounds very different from a metallic strange green material. They don't flow in the same way. So anyway, if you are naming types, it's worth it to consider setting your variable adjectives in this order. I cannot find, or I did not in my short time researching this, find any type that did not match this. Okay. If you do find one, please let me know in the comments down below or yell at me somehow. But sort of a short digression there. So when you name things, you're naming classes or structures. You're naming them after nouns primarily. Now you can augment those nouns with an adjective or multiple adjectives, okay? But they should be nouns. So don't name a class just an adjective. Fast doesn't really do anything. Now, fast is an adjective or an acronym for something. Probably spell out the acronym. Okay. But a class is itself a abstraction of a noun. So you should name it a noun. So interfaces, almost exactly the same as classes, but it's usually I verbable or I noun or I adjective noun. So you can have verbs that are part of the name, because enumerable, you can enumerate something or you can format something. But don't lose the I as the first thing as an interface. It's very important. I second the fourth. I second the comment. Okay. Enumerations, they can be nouns or verbs or the adjective. Okay. I will talk about the final project at the end of lecture, but let's keep going here. There are special types of classes, specifically exceptions are one of them. And an exception should always end with the name of the error, right? Use something that is informative. We haven't talked about delegates. Delegates are like anonymous methods. We're not going to talk about those, so I'm not going to worry about it. But you should always finish them with delegate or handler. So I talked about, how long can things be? The answer is they can be as long as required. Okay, don't abbreviate them if you're going to lose clarity. If you've ever seen me typing in class, almost half the time I type 3 letters and then press Control Space. That's why autocomplete exists. Okay. Sometimes I do put a little bit of thought into my names so that the first couple of characters clear up what type I'm going to be talking about or what variable I'm going to be talking about, or at least get me into a ballpark of the 2 or 3 variables I need to choose between. So take advantage of autocomplete. It's in almost all modern IDEs. Even text editors that are just plain text editors have basic autocomplete. Notepad++, if it's seen a variable or any word or text before, it will try to autocomplete that for you. Atom has also good autocomplete features, although I haven't used it as much. Okay, so when you're using namespaces, which so far we've only really ever used one namespace, and probably for your final project, you're only going to use one namespace, the adventure game namespace. But it's still Pascal case, and if you're using namespaces nested inside of namespaces, it goes sort of back to front from how you might think. You can think of it as the first thing is the most generic name of your company, for example, and then a particular product, and then a component, and then a class inside of that. It gets more specific as it goes on. You'll see this a lot if you ever look at the .NET Windows components, so for graphical user interfaces. You'll see this a lot. You always go from most general and getting more and more specific. Okay. I don't think we need to talk about assemblies. So, naming methods. Naming methods, they should be meaningful, just like everything else. We should be meaningful with our names. And think about what Batman says. It's what he does, not what he is on the outside. Okay. what is it? The name of the method should answer the question, what does this method do? And this is sort of this middle bullet point here is really a key bullet point. If you can't think of a good name for what this method is supposed to do, maybe it should be two different methods, or maybe you should be thinking about your approach a little differently. Because if you cannot clearly define what the method is supposed to do, chances are you haven't thought about the problem enough. So if you don't have a clear intent or a clear mandate, take a step back, don't start writing the method. Maybe you should be splitting this method up into different parts, okay? And that's something that if you're just trying to get something done, you may skip over this step, and then you may find yourself coded into a corner. So find student tells you what it's going to do. It's going to find a student. Loading a report. Okay. Hopefully your arguments to these methods also have meaningful argument names. So loading a report from a string file name. Okay, that tells you where the report's being loaded from. Sometimes methods like these in red do show up, handle stuff, sample method, dirty hack, but they're not good practice, right? A dirty hack may be good to get something started, but it should be there temporarily. You would certainly never want to commit something like this to your repo. Maybe you do it as a dirty hack to do a test just locally, but before you commit that to your repository, you would clean that up. You would give it a clearly defined name, or you'd split that dirty hack up into a correct sequence of methods. And much like everything else we've done, Pascal case. All right. Furthermore, if you have a method that is returning a value, all right, the method name should describe what the value is going to do, or in what format the return value is going to be. So if you have a method called convert that doesn't tell you what you're converting from or to, your method arguments might have a variable like inches, okay, which tells you you're converting inches, but it doesn't tell you what you're converting to. So converting meters to inches, good name. Meters, inches, it's a shorthand. Doesn't really help. There's no reason to limit your characters. Convert or convert units, not really helpful. Unless, and I could foresee a case where convert unit has many different conversions that it could do, and one of the arguments is some sort of an enumeration like F to C, or Rankine to Kelvin, or something else. Okay, so if it's an argument that specifies how you're going to do it, you could say just convert unit. But if it's a single purpose function, convert meters to inches, spell it out. There's a little bit of wiggle room here. So meters to inches is probably how I would do that. I probably would not go full out convert meters to inches all in words. So to and common numerical substitutions for words are okay. Certainly don't put emojis in, and don't try to do lots of leet speak, but to is kind of an acceptable conversion there. All right. This is, again, part of high quality code. Certainly there are lots of different ways that you could code, and you can have methods that do lots of things. But if you can clearly define a single purpose for a method, you're sort of in keeping with the Linux philosophy, right? Of do one thing and do it really well. If you can write one method with a clearly singular defined purpose and a clear interface, you can always write another method that has nothing to do with that first method. And that's okay. Two methods side by side. A third method could always massage the data from the first method into a format that the third method would understand. So then you have three methods. You started off with two completely unrelated methods. A middle method converts the data that's coming out of the first method into something that the third method would understand. And that's a third. That middle method has a single purpose: convert from this to that. All right. So you always want to keep it to be the smallest domain of information that it needs. Okay, and again, like we talked about last week, if it has multiple purposes, it's probably got weak cohesion, and that's another reason that you might have difficulty naming your method, right? So if it has multiple purposes, usually it's hard to name because it doesn't do just one thing. So chances are, if you have something like that, it probably needs to be split into two methods, and you need to spend the time to define the interface, define the arguments and the return types, sometimes into even more than two methods, multiple methods. Okay, this is difficult to keep track of, this next practice of naming methods consistently. If you have a method called load file and then load font, you have created a consistency. You've created a pattern. Everything starts with load, and then you load something. Load a library, load a file, load a font, load an image, load settings. It's very difficult to keep track of this, but it's worth it to spend the time going over. And if you have anything that is doing some kind of a load, make sure it follows the same format. Use consistency. It's going to help you, again, with your autocomplete, because you'll type load, and then your autocomplete will list, did you want to load a file, a font, a library, settings? But you won't see read text file in there because they're not named consistently. So when I talked about defining your classes such that autocomplete is a help rather than a hindrance, this consistent naming is a big part of that. Okay. And again, you don't have to worry so much these days about how long the method name should be. Let it be as long as required. Okay, no one is going to judge you on the length of your name. You can say load customer support notification service. Do not ld cust sup not serve. Doesn't really help. Okay, read it out loud. Oh, load cust sup serve. Yeah, that's, just don't do that. Okay. When you're naming the parameters or the arguments to a method, same rules apply. Okay, we're usually using noun or adjective noun. The only difference is now we're using camel case. The only difference between Pascal case and camel case is the first letter. In camel case, the first letter is lowercase. And make them, descriptive. Last name is descriptive, but make sure it starts with that lowercase l. First name, report, user list. Report probably is going to be based on the context of the method's information around it. All right. Variable names inside of a function follow the same thing as arguments, camel case, noun, or adjective noun, and they should explain the reason that that variable exists. All right. And again, if you can't think of a good name for a variable, maybe you're trying to do too many things with that variable. And as always, I mentioned early on, if you've got a variable with a small scope, a couple of lines, 3 lines, maybe you name it I, that's okay. But for anything with a larger scope than maybe just a few lines, you want to keep that name descriptive. And the same rules for consistent naming should apply. Okay. So again, variables like foo and bar, if they're going to be used for more than, say, 3 lines, they're not really helpful. Okay. Okay. Questions on that? That's all variable naming stuff. And just how you should be naming your variables. All right. This is another one that's I find tough for people just starting out, because as engineers we tend to think in computer terms. And when I mean computer terms, how something is accomplished. Accounts linked list tells you that this is about accounts and it's going to be stored in a linked list. But the whole purpose of object-oriented programming in many cases is to abstract away the details of how something is created or how something is done. So the note here is use terms and nouns from the business domain rather than from computer domains. Basically says take all that computer science knowledge that you have, all that computer engineering knowledge, and just put that in a little drawer when you're coming up with variable names. Okay, keep things as agnostic from the implementation details as possible. Okay, Boolean variables have some special rules, and usually it's because you want to be able to read things in English. So using prefixes actually makes things pretty simple. Things like is, has, and can, especially think about the word found. Is found, can be found, can hash, can convert. Those Boolean variables, if you put them into a larger expression, you always, by the way, want to use positive names. Don't do the negative, like not found. Then you're trying to say if not found, which doesn't make sense. If you use the positive version, though, you could then say exclamation found, and you would read that as if not found. So you always want to make sure that your Boolean variables reflect the idea of the positive condition, found, converted, has pending payment, is prime. Okay, all of those are valid names. But anything with a negation in front of it gives you a double negative. You want to avoid those. Okay. If you do have a counter that's being used for a larger period of time than a few lines, you're not going to want to use I. You are going to want to talk about what you are counting. So it's usually whatever noun you're counting, followed by count. All right. States for a state machine, same thing. Put state there. If you are using counters, you can have small scope, index, I, it's allowed. I know I said last time, you can sometimes use temporary variable names, like things like temp. Yeah, they say that there is better ways to do that, and they're right. It all depends on what the scope is. Certainly using old value is better. This is exactly the example I used last class or 2 classes ago, swapping 2 variables in an array. Int temp a equals I, a sub I equals a sub j equals temp. Yeah, old value is more descriptive. So it all depends on who you're working with. You're going to have to agree as part of your programming guidelines what you're going to use. If your guidelines say don't use the word temp, don't use temp. Use something a little bit more descriptive. And in this case, it's easy to convert it because that's the whole point. It's the old value. Now, I would argue that that really is a temporary location, but I digress. Okay, length of variable names. Once again, it depends on how long the variable is going to exist for. Okay, if the variable exists for a very short amount of time, probably you don't need to have a very long name for it because it's only going to exist for a short time. So generally, if you can keep all instances or all uses of a variable in a single screen, you can use a short name. If it's going to exist for multiple screens worth of information, you have to name it a longer name, a more self-explanatory name. And that's part of that self-documenting code that some people say don't exist, but I argue if you have a class called student with a variable called last name, it's probably the student's last name. Okay. Hungarian notation, which is extremely popular when we were doing Windows programming in unmanaged languages like C++, when doing Windows programming. Back in the day, Windows 95, Windows XP. This was what every variable name looked like. LPCSTR text. That was a long pointer to a string called text. LPDW flags was a long pointer to a word, which was 16 bits, or maybe D word was a double word, so that's 32 bits of flags. CB constant byte. HW was a handle to a window. That Hungarian notation has no place in C#. It exists, it's still used, just not in C#. Okay, don't use prefixes or suffixes to denote information about the data type. You will see this in lots and lots of source code. If for different types of things, just not in C#. Okay. Properties, once again, use Pascal case, and they are nouns or a noun phrase or an adjective. So typically properties of a noun could be the adjective that describes that noun. Okay, but they do follow Pascal case, so the first character capitalized. These are context clues that you are providing for the other people using your code. It tells them what this is. All right. So again, a property starts with Pascal case. That's going to immediately tell you that it's a property, as opposed to a variable which uses camel case, lowercase first letter. All right. Constants, you've actually seen a few of these. Things like pi, e, int max. They are always denoted with capital letters, and they use underscores, not camel case or Pascal case. Okay. Other things that you want to generally avoid are any numbers in your variable names. Print report 2, nah, not really. Why is there a second print report 2? Is it because it's a different kind of report? Well, then describe that in the method name. Okay, describe the difference. Sometimes you start off, oh, I'll call this one 2, and then you're going to erase print report 1. Spend the time, say version 2, or imply that there's a reason that this one exists at the same time. Okay, make it easy to track in your Git tracker. Okay, so at some point you're going to have some Git commit where you remove print report and print report 2 becomes print report without the 2. So make sure that it's clear what's going on there. The only time numbers are really allowed when it's actually part of the name, if you're describing something. Yeah, get section, that's one of the exceptions right there, right? If it's part of it. Com3 describes communication port 3. Section 1 describes section 1 in the file. I could have said get file section or get data section 1. I could have gone ahead and put in get long description, get short description. That would have been acceptable as well. The comment was get section 1, get section 2. What about get section 3, professor? Didn't you do that last class? Huh? Are you breaking your own rules, professor? Yes. Except for the exception. It's literally on the screen right now. It's allowed if it's part of the name. I chose, as the developer, to stay faithful to the source data file to make communication between those easy. So when you're looking at the data file, the descriptions are talking about section numbers. So my method names match up with the documentation. That's part of self-documenting code. As exciting as it may be to use special characters, so certainly calculate ohms to protein, certainly is human readable and it uses less characters and it clearly defines what's going on, but it relies on the fact that you are going to be using the same font as the next guy. So the next guy, his font might not render the ohm symbol as an omega. It may just show up as a box. So don't use any foreign alphabets or special characters. Stick to your standard alphanumeric underscore characters. There's a special place in hell for people who give misleading names to something. If you give something that is completely opposite of what something does, you're gonna find yourself the target of a very bad day. Okay. It's actually worse than giving it something that's unclear. Okay. If you have something that's doing a bunch of additions and you name it calculate negative number, you're gonna shoot, because think about you as a programmer, right? You step into somebody else's code and you look at it and you have to make an assumption about the person who wrote the code. A, they know what they're talking about, And therefore, there was a reason for them to call this check for negative number, even though it looks like it's adding. So you're going to spend more time looking at that. Or B, you have to assume that they were an idiot. And then you ignore that at your peril. And you go ahead and rename it, only to find out later that they did actually know what they were talking about. And there was a reason. And a lot of that can boil down to copy and paste. You saw last class that there was a copy and paste error. This is production software that's been in use in many places for years. It had a copy paste error, okay? Just because they were taking two similar variable names that were well named, they were described correctly, but it was so close that when they copy and pasted it, they didn't change all the things they needed to change. It happens. And this ties right into making an assumption, right? You have to assume whether or not the person who who wrote the code that you're reading knew what they were talking about. And in the Win32 API, there are some things that don't follow these conventions. There are definitely two methods. One's called navigate, one's called navigate to inside of a particular DLL. And you don't just follow them, okay? Always give yourself a chance to think for a little bit about why something was named that way. If you do find a long pointer to a user info structure with an _1, is there an _2? Is there something with no underscore? Is it just info? What is the difference? Take the time to do a little research, okay? Okay, so this is real code. I think this link now goes to docs.microsoft.com, but everything else. What is wrong with this code? Take a moment, take a look at it. I'll look at it, right? It opens up a file stream. Looks like, based on the convention, that's all caps. So that says to me that that's a constant file name. Okay. Creates a binary writer. So it's going to be writing binary data to this new file. And it writes data to test.data. Well, I don't see a test.data, so that's misleading comments. It writes the code. It writes an integer into W. W is the binary writer. That's a great variable name, right? Yes, aside from it being blood red is the convention for bad code. fs.close, w.close. Then it creates a reader for the data, same constant file name, open for read. Okay. Does a binary reader. Yep. And then it reads a bunch of int32s. On the whole, it looks like it probably works, right? Okay. But W is not a descriptive variable name. We don't know what the data is that we're dealing with. We are using I, but I is okay. See if I can actually pull this up real quick. Actually, yeah, it's sort of irrelevant. Okay. This was when we started talking about code quality, right? This is simply the spacing. This compiles. This is completely correct. It does run, okay? It's just god-awful to look at. It was like somebody copied it into Word and then hit justify. So there's weird spacing everywhere. The comments do exist, but they're all over the place. So code needs to be formatted to make sure that it's readable. And if it's readable, it's maintainable. Secondly, you want the formatting of the code to imply its logical structure. Python takes this to the next level. There are no squiggly brackets in Python. The number of spaces tells you what nested structure some line belongs to. If it's nested twice, it's 2 levels deep. That's it. That's all there is. And heaven help you if you put a tab and 4 spaces near one another, because that counts as 5 characters, not 2 tabs, even though 4 spaces usually is about the same width as 1 tab. Okay? Any formatting style that follows the above principle is good. Anything else is not good. Hard to say it more than that. No, Python would eat your face with bad white spacing. In fact, I mentioned I don't know 2 classes ago about the PEP guidelines, PEP 8. I usually keep my book, my helpful book here. Well, I keep a little handbook right near my machine usually as a style guide for Python. And that style guide lists a bunch of these things and just, helpful things, tips that you can look through. But one of the guidelines in PEP 8 describes how you should space between a variable, an equal sign, and its assigned value, and whether or not multiple spaces are allowed. Spoiler alert, they're not. So if you are in C#, those squiggly brackets, they go on the line underneath. It is bad form to do that any other way. So you Java folks, bye. Indent the block contents with a single tab. I'll fight them on this. This is real. Certainly, I would say don't mix spaces and tabs. Okay, there are many editors. Actually, Notepad is one of them. If you go to Notepad, it's so important that there are actually quick. Oh, you can't see that. Well, if you go to edit, there is a blank operation. You can convert tabs to spaces, spaces to tabs, back and forth. And if you look at things here, there's a bunch of tabs. If I actually run the blank operation tab to space, everything is preserved, but instead of several tabs now, you have spaces. So something to keep in mind, that you want to be able to view that sort of information. Back to Foxit. Okay, so don't indent with spaces, indent with tabs. All right, I think this has been ingrained for quite a while. I don't think we have to spend a long time talking about this. Everything gets a single tab in. Every time you go into some sort of sub body, you go in one tab. Okay. So this goes back to that spacing. You will generally only put spaces in between the type and the variable name. So nothing in between the function name and the parenthesis, or any parenthesis in anything really. Okay. Same with if conditionals or for conditionals, no extraneous spaces. You don't need them. They just make people wonder, why would you do that? Was there some reason? And if there isn't, then don't do it. Okay. Parameters follow the English conventions, comma, then space. Okay. Excuse me. Do put the space. Don't ignore the space. Space belongs there. All right. The squiggly brackets, okay, in a single line of an if statement. So again, for any construct, if or for, if there's only a single line or a single entity that's part of that block, you don't need the squiggly brackets. And what they're saying here is, we didn't have space to show you everything, but you should always do it. And the reason is because if you come back and add a line later, you might forget the squiggly brackets, and then bad problems occur because you think that something is doing something, specifically because you put a tab there. Therefore, you assume logically that everything that's tabbed to that level is in fact going to be executed in that if block. But that's not the case. There have to be the squiggly brackets there. And they say, keep a space between each method. Okay. Empty lines should be used sparingly inside of a method, and they are supposed to logically separate blocks. Okay, if you have a block of code and then something is related but different, so income reports are different from expense reports, which are different from leaving the function, you can logically connect those by putting white space. There's almost never a reason to do double white space. Single empty line is enough to separate things. Okay. Putting empty lines where none belong just invite gremlins, right? Why were there empty spaces here? No reason at all. Okay. So there's no logical reason to separate writing the item from writing the space. In fact, those are closely connected. Don't separate them. Okay. So anything, whether it's a class, a structure, an interface, a for loop, everything gets indented with one single tab. But inside of these structures, we usually define things always in the same order so that we know how to find things. So if we go to a new class, we know that constants will always be defined first, delegates, inner types second, then fields, constructors, properties, methods, always in that order. So we haven't done a lot with inner types, although I did show you an inner type in the room class, right? I defined that enumeration. It's an inner type. So fields first, then constructors, then the properties that you're going to define for that class, and then the methods for that class. And likewise, we do almost, we always do static members, then public members, then protected members, then internal, then private. Typically, we only have either static or public or private or protected. There are other ways to do that. It's not the only way to do it. It's not going to yell at you if you don't do it this way, but keep it consistent. So here, static variables, we don't have any. We've got a constant. We've got an constant static variable species. Int is an instance variable, the constructor, then the property, then the methods, okay, in that order. Okay. So again, if you have any kind of construct that has a nested operation inside of it, put the squiggly brackets there. Even if it's just one line, you may need to put another line there in the future. Always put that squiggly bracket, and never put it on the same line as the if or the for or the while. Always put it on the next line. And there's never any reason to indent with more than one tab per nested line. So it may be convenient to say everything on one line, as you see in that example right there, right? Console write line. And so maybe for some debug statement, you're just trying to get something out there real quick, sure, fine. But you would never do that in production code. Not to say I haven't seen it in production code, just you shouldn't do it. And don't do this because we're not programming in Java. No Java. The only real way is that first example, okay? So there are going to be times where long lines are unavoidable. So this is a great example here. We're looking at anything that is in a cardinal direction around some element in a matrix. So the matrix element xy, x minus 1 is going to be the element to the left of it, x plus 1 is going to be the element to the right of it, y minus 1 is going to be the one above it, y plus 1 is the one below it. So if the element or any element in a cardinal direction is equal to 0. There are a couple of ways you could handle this. First off, you could abstract this into its own test, right? You could write a thing that says, if cardinals equal 0 and pass the matrix and the x and the y. That's a descriptive method name that you could call, keeps your code readable. It makes it sound more like an English sentence. If any element surrounding xy is 0, okay, fine. But if it's not worth it to you to put that in, you can separate them onto multiple lines. There's nothing saying, in fact, there's lots of things you can do to make white space do weird things, right? But to do it properly, big air quotes, properly in a convention, all you do is you take after a particular punctuation, so the or in this case, the logical or, go to the next line, indent by a single tab. This is also something that a lot of people will do. They'll take and they'll tab until they're about at the if, and then they'll space until the m's line up in matrix. And that may look nice, but don't do anything special like that. The convention is single tab, okay? That's just the convention. Even if you're just having one line, right? Not a clause. A new dictionary entry for a key value pair. You can split that up into multiple lines. Keep it with logical groups though, okay? If you're going to split it up, first line just declares the variable. Second line is all of the boilerplate to define the type. And then the third is the key and the value. That's okay. If the key is a long expression, keep the key on one line, okay? Then the value on the next line. If the key goes longer than one line, okay, so maybe it takes up a full line and then another half line, don't start the value there. Let yourself go to the next line. You've got plenty of white space. So things like things you take for granted. Don't leave people hanging. You're not writing a novel. Don't put a cliffhanger, okay? Don't say equals what? Because then somebody's going to think, "Oh, did they forget to type what it was supposed to be equal to?" This, if you look at this line in isolation, this looks like 0 logically ORed with something. So that sounds like false logically ORed with something else, which is basically why would you put this here at all? So again, you have to think and that cognitive load is something you don't need. You're trying to keep the entire structure of the program in your head. You don't need little weird problems like this. So, rules. Always on the punctuation of a closed clause. So, here, matrix xy equals 0, matrix x minus 1, comma y equals 0. Then, or, and then start with matrix x plus 1. Weird tabbing. All right, this is sort of taking it to the other extreme. Instead of being under tabbed, it's over tabbed. Just a single tab is all you need. This technically compiles old entry new line dot key. That's allowed because the dot is an operator, and you can have white space in between an operator and its operand. But it certainly looks like the key is just old entry, not old entry dot key, and that's very misleading. And as I said a few slides ago, more than a few slides ago, where did it go? Giving a misleading name or misleading the programmer is worse than giving nothing, right? So making them write their own function would have been better than giving them that. Ooh, where did I go? Too far. Nope, haven't gone far enough. Okay. Implying that the key is just old entry. It's just mean. Okay. Now, I say that you're doing this to other people, by the way. Chances are you're going to be doing it to yourself. You're going to be the one who's in charge of maintaining your own code base. So if you come back to code 6 weeks, 6 months, 6 years down the line, you're going to be angry with yourself. And if it's your code, you'll have no one to blame but yourself. I wish that this wasn't the case. My OCD, my own brand of OCD, says that top looks beautiful. But it's hard to maintain, and I understand the argument. It certainly looks nice. You know, in the bottom, you can clearly see that we're testing a bunch of things for equal to 0. But if you go back and change that, you're going to have to make sure that you put the correct number of spaces in, or if you're using tabs, it's going to be even worse because different fonts will render at different sizes. So the convention is don't bother. Single space in between each one of these things, not multiple spaces. It's just the way we do it. Okay. So how do you design a high quality class, right? We've talked about what abstraction is. We've talked about cohesion and coupling. I think we'll start on this on Friday, but let me briefly talk about the project and how the project is going to be graded. Okay, so you're going to be doing 10 to 15 minute presentations, and those presentation signups are going to go out on a first come first serve basis via email. I'll send out a thing with the slots, and or actually I'll post it on the lecture slide, and you can send me email. But what am I going to be grading you on? Well, I'm going to be grading you on partially how much of the program you have completed. Okay. Now that involves reading in pieces of the data file. It involves parsing commands. It involves a game loop. It involves special words. It involves items and their ability to be manipulated. So it's up to you to define and tell me how successful you've been in the project. Okay, you're giving the presentation. Can we build on your code? Of course, you can take my code verbatim. But if you just give me my code, you're not going to get a great grade. You'll get a grade. It probably won't even be a failing grade. But if you just give to me what I have given to you, that's not really doing the project. So I'm going to be looking for more than that. No, I gave you that code and I spent the 2 weeks going over those pieces so that you would have a starting point. That's allowed. Okay, that code is, I'm not going to post it anywhere, but I mean, the lectures are online. You can type it out yourself. And part of that is I think that there's an added benefit. If you type out the code yourself, you are going to see what grade are we talking? I don't know, like a 55. What do you want from me? Like a 70? No, no. You would probably be like a D minus if you just handed me back what I gave you, if that. If you only gave me what I gave you, first off, there are some bugs in my code, and I would be sure to call it out in the presentation, and so you would not do well. But I'm not expecting anyone is going to completely generate the full game. That's not what I'm looking for here. I'm looking for you to choose pieces of the game that you find interesting, and I want you to showcase them to me. So we're going to have Zoom stuff. I'm going to share the screen, or let whoever wants to share the screen in the group, and you're going to run the game, and you're going to show me what's going on. And I may ask you to try to, type a command in, a particular command, and that's fine. But that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for you guys to have some fun, be creative, and if you want to add different things, and even if let's say you don't get anything particularly working, if you implement some sort of a debug interface to show me where the problems occur, because I don't care that you just succeed. I care what problems you're having. So if you get to 50% completion, or pick some random number, and then you show me this is where it breaks, okay? This is what we're going to do. It would be unfair for me to grade the people who present first as the same as the people who present last, because they're going to have more days to complete their project. So what you're doing is you're giving me a snapshot of your project at that point in time, okay? Your project report, and I put report in air quotes, is just going to be the README file in your GitHub repo. Okay, so your GitHub is going to have your report as the README.markdown file. You're just going to list out everything that you've done. These are the classes, these are the images. Okay, so it's built into your repository. Okay, oh, that reminds me. Tim asked me to mention to you that if you are generating a Visual Studio project, and let's just swap over here. When you are in a Visual Studio project, if you have added it to source control, as say Quadratic has down here. Oh, it hasn't actually. This one has not been added to source control. Let me open up one that has. Recent projects, Adventure Starter. Adventure Starter has. You can't see it, but it's down there, right? That's the Git. No concrete amount of items or locations. I would certainly be very disappointed if you didn't have at least the ability to pick up an item and drop an item. But if you can implement one location, that means you've read through the whole file anyway. So that's sort of a bit of a weird question. What I was going to say though was, if I go to the file view, there is a file called .gitignore. This was generated by Visual Studio. Okay, it specifies that it should not put output files into the GitHub repository. So like, it's not going to put any of the debug or the binary files, because GitHub doesn't do a good job of tracking, or Git as a general rule, of dealing with changes in binary files. So none of these files, all of these extensions, don't actually contribute to your project. Really, it's just the solution, the C project, the C# project, and the CS files, right? But it's important that you do have some kind of git ignore. And if you don't have one of those git ignore files, you can go to website. Yes. Git ignore. If you just search git ignore, GitHub has a collection of .git ignores. Okay, so whether you're doing Ada development or Composer or Eagle for your circuit board designs, Visual Studio under V, Visual Studio.gitignore. This is the default Visual Studio. You can just click on this, download it, and when you drop it into your Git repository, it will automatically ignore all that stuff for you. Okay. Okay. So that's it. Does that answer people's questions about how the project is going to get graded? And it's a little bit on a curve, right? We're all dealing with this remote learning as best we can, right? So if the whole class kind of does about the same, I'm not going to unfairly penalize you. I'm not going to give you all Fs. That would be unfair, right? So it's going to be an indicator of how did you do against your fellow group members. If there are any seniors in here today, I know we have about 25% seniors. If you're trying to get into the senior design room to get your stuff, there are half-hour sign-out times tomorrow. There's still 2 or 3 available. Most people have emailed me, but you cannot get on campus, right? I will be on campus on Thursday, and I will let one person from the group in at a time to collect the stuff. Call my office after you signed up for a time, and I will come down. I will let you into the building. I will let you go up, get the stuff from the senior design room, because your key cards are all disabled, I believe. And then you will be able to leave with the stuff. So that's for seniors, not specifically C++ or C#. All right. Okay, I will see you all on Friday.